Okay, so Melina, just to catch up, we have a square. A square has four 90-degree angles. And so if you make a triangle within the square and you cut the two 90-degree angles in half, you have 45, 45, and your third angle is a 90-degree angle. So we could use Pythagorean theorem to find the last side. So I know 2 squared plus 2 squared is 4 plus 4. And then so 8 is equal to c squared. And obviously, so hopefully you remember this from last week. To find out what c is, you need to take the square root of both sides. And so c is equal to the square root of 8. But if we want it in simplest radical form, we should do our factor tree here. And then 4 breaks down into 2 and 2. Remember, we circle our pair. And then so c is equal to whatever you circle goes on the outside, whatever you don't circle goes on the inside. So it's 2 radical 2. So I know that if A and B are 2, C here is 2 radical 2. Okay, so let's see what happens if instead of a side length of 2, we have a side length of 3. So once again, since it's a square, so those are all 90 degrees.
Mr. Castillo, do you always put it in simplest form?
Usually for Pythagorean theorem, like the directions will either say simplest radical form or decimal. But for this, for these problems, we're going to do radical form because it's going to lead to something. But depending on the instructions, it could be radical or it could be decimal form. So here, once again, I have this is a 45, 45, 90. And so this is 3, and this is 3, and we're going to find our last side. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and use Pythagorean theorem again. And I'll get 3 squared plus 3 squared is equal to c squared. And so this is 9 plus 9 is equal to c squared. So I get 18 is equal to c squared. And then so once again, I'm going to go ahead and take the square root of both sides. And so I get c is equal to the square root of 18. And then so here, I'm going to do the same thing that I did on the left side, simplest radical form. 18 is just 9 times 2. And 9 is 3 times 3. So if I circle that, because it's a pair, I get c is equal to 3 radical 2. And now here's the big reason why we left it in radical form and not decimal form. So I want you to take a look at what happens with the side measures. Look at the left 45, 45, 90 triangle. If I have 2 and 2, the hypotenuse is just 2 root 2. If the side lengths are 3, 3, 3, and then the hypotenuse is 3 root 2. So there's a pattern here. If you know what the legs are, you should know what the hypotenuse is, and you don't even have to go through Pythagorean theorem. So you could always go through Pythagorean theorem, but this lesson will show you how to do it without Pythagorean theorem. So the rule is, and I hope all of you kind of get it, like let's say the sides were 6 and 6. The hypotenuse would just be 6 root 2, right? So the rule is illustrated right here. In a 45, 45, 90 triangle, both legs are congruent. Okay, so the legs are the same. The hypotenuse is you just take the leg and you multiply it by root 2. That's it. Okay. Once you know what the legs are, you know what the hypotenuse is, you just have to multiply by root 2. So before we go on to apply this rule, I want to review some multiplication of radicals, just so that we don't need to review it when we actually do the problems. We'll just do it all at once here. There's a couple of rules here. So first rule, if I multiply two separate radicals like root 2 times root 5, all you do is you just multiply what's underneath that, just root 10. Okay, let's look at number 2. If I have root 2 times root 2, I know this is root 4. However, I know root 4 is just equal to 2. Now for number 3, root 3 times root 3, that's root 9. But I know root 9 is just equal to 3. Then root 4 times root 4 is root 16. And I know that's equal to 4. Now, I want you to take a note, and I've actually mentioned this in class before. If you are ever multiplying two radicals that are the same, like root 2 times root 2, you should know the answer is just whatever's underneath the radical. Because remember, squaring something and square rooting something cancel. So root 2 times root 2 is the same thing as root 2 squared. So they cancel, so you're just left with 2. Root 3 times root 3 is just 3. Root 4 times root 4 is 4. So you should all know that root 57 times root 57 is just going to be 57. You don't even need to multiply 57 times 57. You know the answer is just going to be 57. Okay. Now, number 6, I just want to show you this one again. I think we kind of talked about it when we did the Pythagorean theorem. But if I have 4 root 2 times 4 root 2, remember 4 times 4 is 16. But we just did root 2 times root 2 back in number 2 here. Root 2 times root 2 is just 2. So this is 16 times 2. And that's 32.
Mister,
Yeah.
how is number 5 57?
I kind of went over it here because look, root 2 times root 2 is root 4. But
Yeah.
4 is just 2. Root 3 times root 3 is root 9. Root 9 is 3.
Mm-hmm.
Root 4 times root 4 is root 16. The answer is 4. So
So
if you
like did 57 57 got to answer.
Yeah, because root 57 is actually, yeah, it's root some big number. But if you take the square root of that, it ends up being 57, because remember, squaring something and square rooting something just cancel each other out.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now we're going to go back to the 45, 45, 90 triangle. Okay. So if I have a 45, 45, 90 triangle, remember the rule is the sides are the same, and you just multiply by root 2 to get the hypotenuse. So let's say this is this is 45, 45, and 90. And so here's the relationship. X x, x root 2. The two things are always the same here, and then I just multiply by root 2 to go ahead and get the hypotenuse. So let's look at the first row. If one side is 5, the other side has to also be 5. And then the hypotenuse, I just multiply by root 2, so it's just 5 root 2. Okay. Let's look at the second row. 3 radical 2. So I know this one has to also be 3 radical 2. Now, how do we find the hypotenuse? Well, the rule is if you know the leg, all you have to do is just multiply by root 2. So if you know the leg to get the hypotenuse in a 45, 45, 90, all you do is you just multiply by root 2. So root 2 times root 2, and we just went over this, right? When you multiply up here, like number 2, this is just going to be 3 times 2. So Tony, it's that same thing again, right? Root 2 times root 2, you could just say it becomes 2, right? And so 3 times 2 is 6. So what I want you to do is I want you to do the next 2 rows on your own. Okay. So this one is 10, obviously, and then this will be 10 root 2. Simple as that. Next row, this should be radical 3, because the two things are always the same in the beginning. And now, what's root 3 times root 2? Root 6, right? This is just like number 1 up here, right? If I multiply root 3 times root 2, I get root 6. Now, think about this one. This next row should be kind of simple. If I know this is 150 root 2, what should the two legs be? $150, right? If you follow the pattern, if you know the hypotenuse is 150 root 2, the leg should be 150. Yep. We're going to skip this one right now. And now let's just go ahead and do the next 2. So I know this should be root 2. And then so to get the hypotenuse, all I do is I just multiply root 2 times root 2. And that's equal to 2. This next row, this is 100 root 2. And so be careful here. If I have 100 root 2 times root 2, what would the answer be here? Anyone type it in? Or you could say it.
Would the answer be 2 and 5, like how it was on the first one?
You mean with the radical? Well, no, it's 100 on the outside, right?
Oh,
100
it's
radical
100
4.
100 radical 4, which is the same as what? So radical 4 is the same as 2, right? So this is just 100 times 2. And that's 200. Okay. So 100 radical 4 is correct. But remember, radical 4 is just equal to 2. So we did this problem up here. Look at number 2 here, right? Radical 4 is equal to 2. So Tony, what I want you to get in your head is that when you see two radicals that are the same, root 2 times root 2, that just becomes 2. That's the same thing as root 57 times root 57 is 57.
My bad, mister. I was looking at the wrong one. I was looking at the one under that.
Okay. So this is 200. Okay, we're going to skip this one again. And now let's go ahead and do the last two. So if I have 4 root 2, so I'm going to have 4 root 2 times root 2. Okay. So Ronnie, can you actually tell me what the hypotenuse should be here?
Eight radical 2.
It should just be 8. So where did you get the... So Ronnie, remember radical 2 times radical 2 is 2, right? So I'm going to keep this 4 here, but radical 2 times radical 2 is just 2. So my answer is 8. So I want you to see the kind of what's happening here. If I multiply by root 2, the root 2 and the root 2 multiplied with each other becomes 2. Because you're right, Rodney, from before. Root 2 times root 2 is root 4. But root 4 is really just equal to 2. Okay. Okay, so now let's do this one, 2 root 6. And then so if I do 2 root 6 times root 2, I know that this is going to be equal to 2 root 12. Okay. Now, I see root 12. You could actually still put that in simplest radical form, right? 12 can break down into 4 and 3. And 4 breaks down into 2 and 2. So I circled that 2. And that goes to the outside. But look what I have on the outside already. There's already a 2. So if I bring out another 2, I just multiply those two 2's. So it's going to be 4. And then I still didn't circle the 3. So this is 4 radical 3. Don't worry too much about that last one if you didn't get all the way down to 4 root 3. Okay, but I need you guys to understand at least these ones here, right? The 4 root 2 times root 2 is 8. The 100 root 2 times root 2 is 200, right? Same thing happens here on the top. 3 root 2 times root 2 becomes 3 times 2, and that's 6.
Sir, how come the answer wasn't just 12?
You can leave it as 12. Wait, radical 12? Or just 12, 12?
Just 12.
Okay, that's a good question. I know what you're trying to say. Because the 6 and 2 are different. So you can't cancel out the square root unless they're the same number. Okay? So if I have root 2 times root 2, then it just becomes 2. If I have root 3 times root 3, then it just becomes 3. However, if I have root 6 and root 2, since they're not the same number, we're not really squaring the numbers, so it doesn't cancel out the square root. Okay. Now, I'm actually going to get back to, I'm not going to worry about this root 10 one. I don't need to worry about that one. I'm going to worry about this one here. So all of these problems, we've given you the leg, and you found the hypotenuse by multiplying by root 2. Okay? So leg to hypotenuse, you multiply by root 2. So if we're going to go in reverse, if we're going to go from hypotenuse to the leg, we're just going to do the opposite of multiplying by root 2. I'm just going to divide by root 2. Okay, so let me show you how that works. I'm going to do the 6 here, and I'm going to divide by root 2. So if I do 6 and I divide by root 2, I'm going to write it like this, 6 over root 2. Now, this is something you probably covered in Algebra 1, so it's probably been a while since you've done this. If you remember, they've told you that when you're working with radicals, you never want a radical in the denominator. So we did something called rationalizing the denominator, and this is how we do it. Whatever radical you have on the bottom, and you only do it when you have a radical on the bottom. You don't do this anytime else. If you have a radical on the bottom, the way you're going to rationalize it is you multiply the top and bottom by whatever that radical is. Now I'm going to show you why we do that.
Mr. Castillo.
Yeah.
Where the hell did you get a fraction from?
So, like I said, dividing is the same thing as making something a fraction, right? So if I go from the hypotenuse to the leg, I have to divide by root 2.
Okay, so if you're going back like to find the other leg and you have the hypotenuse, that's when you divide.
Yeah. Okay. So
okay,
that's why I have the fraction here as 6 over root 2.
okay,
That's division. Okay. Now, and then like I said, we don't want this radical on the bottom, so I'm going to multiply the top and bottom by radical 2. So what happens? So remember, like we've done many times here, on the bottom, root 2 times root 2 just becomes 2. And then the top becomes 6 radical 2. And then now we can just reduce that because I know 6 divided by 2 is 3. So my answer here is 3 radical 2. So that means up here, this will be 3 radical 2. And that will be 3 radical 2 up here for the 2 legs. Okay.
Do you always divide by radical 2?
If you're going backwards, yes. For 45, 45, 90, Rodney, yes. Okay. Now, so this is what your homework is going to look like. Okay, so we understood this here, but this is what your homework is going to look like here. But it's kind of the same thing. So for example, you don't need to make that table that we've been doing every single time, but if it helps, right? So let's look at number 1. Once again, you don't have to do this. And for the rest of them, I'm not going to do the table, but I'm going to show you it's the same thing we were doing in the table. I know one of the legs is 8. So that means the other leg is 8. And that means the hypotenuse is just 8 root 2, right? So I know B here is 8. And then A is just 8 root 2. Okay. So go ahead. The way this is going to work, I do the left side, and then you're going to do the problem on the right. It's just the same thing, right? So everyone quickly do number 2. Should be fairly simple. And then I'm going to keep going on, and we'll just trade off until we're done. Okay. So for number 2, obviously y should be 6 because the 2 legs need to be the same. And then I multiply by root 2 to get the hypotenuse. So it should be 6 root 2. Okay, now let's look at number 3. So I know, looking at this, I know b should automatically be 5 root 2. The two legs are always the same. Now, how do I go from the leg to the hypotenuse? All I do is I just multiply by root 2. So 5 root 2 times root 2, right? So once again, don't forget about this. Root 2 times root 2 is really just equal to 2. So this is 5 times 2, which is equal to 10. Okay. And that's A. So go ahead and do number 4 now. Okay, so V should be 3 root 2. And then Rodney, what should U be? Just want to make sure you got this one.
I got 6.
6, yeah, 6 is right. Okay. So it's just 3 root 2 times root 2, which is 3 times 2, and that's 6. Okay. 5, don't worry if you get like some kind of fraction, but the same thing happens, you do the same thing. So y here is the same thing as the other leg. So y is 3 root 2 all over 2. So same thing happens. I'm going to multiply the leg by root 2 to find the hypotenuse. So x is equal to 3 root 2 over 2, and I multiply that by root 2. Now let's look what happens here. I know that root 2 times root 2 is just equal to 2. So this becomes x is equal to 3 times 2 all over 2. Does everyone see how I got that? The root 2 times the root 2 is just 2. And then I keep everything else the same. So this is 6 over 2, which is equal to 3. Okay, go ahead and do number 6 now. So V here should be 7 root 2 over 2. And then if I multiply 7 root 2 over 2 times root 2, this becomes 7 times 2 all over 2, 14 over 2, and that's equal to 7. Number 7 should be this one's kind of easier than the last two. So y here should be 5 root 3. And then x is 5 root 3 times root 2. And so this is just equal to 5 root 6. And remember what Rodney asked earlier, you don't cancel out the square root if they're different numbers. It just becomes 5 radical 6. Okay? So quickly do 8. Okay. So y should be 10 root 5. And then 10 root 5 times root 2. So once again, I just multiply the two radicals. It should be 10 root 10. Any questions on 7 and 8? Those are fairly simple because you just have to multiply the two radicals together. Okay, look at number 9. You should already know what x and y should be. You don't need to do a lot of any work here. Because remember, when we made the table from the 4, if this was 17 root 2, you automatically knew this was 17 and 17, right? Does that make sense to everyone? Because the only way, because if I just multiply by root 2, it's just that number in front. So if you ever see the hypotenuse has a root 2 in it, you should automatically know that's that. However, sometimes it might not click in your head. So we're going to go back to, remember how, I'm going to leave this here for a minute. Remember how I said if I'm going from the hypotenuse to the leg, I divide by root 2? I'm going to show you that we get the same answer here. So,
Mister,
yeah.
if that's the case, then how did you get that for number 3? Oh wait, never mind. I figured out because
Yeah.
I messed up on the I put the 3 root 2 as the hypotenuse instead of the leg. All right, so never mind.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, so Tony caught his mistake, but everyone see the difference between 3 and 9, right? 9, the root 2 is on the hypotenuse. But like I said, let's say you forgot that you had to, it was simple as this. If you go from the hypotenuse to the leg, remember how I said you just divide by root 2? But look what happens if I have root 2 over root 2, that just cancels and I'm left with 17. So it's simple either way. Okay. But now the last problems here is going to talk about what we just did right here in this last example where we got the 6 and we got 3 root 2 and 3 root 2. So for number 11, they give you the hypotenuse is 14. And so I know to find the leg, I have to divide by root 2, right? And so remember, this is the only time you're going to do this. If you see the denominator as a radical, you multiply the top and the bottom by that radical. And just for this assignment, it's always going to be root 2 because we're only working with root 2, right? When we divide. So the bottom, root 2 times root 2 is just 2. And the top becomes 14 root 2. And then we could divide 14 by 2. So m is the same as n, and it's equal to 7 root 2. Because remember, m and n have to be equal, right? So once again, I'm going to show you for 12. If I take the hypotenuse and I divide by root 2, I rationalize it by multiplying the top and the bottom by radical 2. So the bottom is 2, and the top is 3 root 2. The only thing that's different about this time is you cannot reduce 3 over 2. So you're just going to leave it as is. Okay, so very quickly do 13 and 14. That'll be it. The homework is just a copy of this except different numbers. So what I would suggest is once you're done with the lecture, go ahead and just start the homework right now since it's all fresh in your head and you have the notes, right? Don't wait. Okay. So we have, remember, you divide by root 2 if you're going from hypotenuse to leg. So I multiply top and bottom by root 2 over root 2. And I get 5 root 2 over 2. I can't simplify that, so that's my final answer.
Mr.
Yeah, go ahead.
You're gonna explain this last question and then we're done?
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. So
I'm only asking because I have to go to work.
oh yeah, for sure. 10 divided by root 2, I multiply top and bottom by root 2 over root 2. And so this gives me 10 root 2, and the bottom just becomes 2. This time you could simplify though. Cool. So that's it. Couple announcements. Late work is due on May 22nd. Remember that any late work during the online learning will not be marked down. So yeah, Tony, I think you're good to go because I will email you about raising a test grade sometime. Okay. I think I'll do that later today.
Mister, are we gonna have a test anytime soon?
I think we just might have one quiz on all of this at the last week. So we're not going to have a final. We might just do one quiz on this material during the finals week, I think. But we're not going to have like a final that covers everything this semester kind of thing. So Tony, you're good to go. You could go to work. Naya, Emily, I think you're all fine. Rodney, is your grade okay for this class? I can't remember. I don't know what it is on top of my head.
I think I had like a C or a B. Not sure.
Yeah. I don't know what it is either, but I know you're not in the danger zone yet, right? You're good.
Yeah, I'm good so far.
Just make up any missing assignments. If you can get the B, try to get the B.
All right.
Okay. Blanca, you're missing a test, right?
Yeah, I'm missing like a test.
It's chapter 8, I believe, right?
Yeah, I'm missing chapter 8.
Okay.
I don't know if it's chapter 7.
Okay, I'm gonna check chapter 7 later on today. Because if you're missing it, I'm gonna send you the video and the study guide for it. Even if it's a low score, I might send it to you. But I know for sure you're missing at least one test. I just can't remember which one it is. But the way we're gonna make all that up in the next couple of weeks. So you just need to worry about making up assignments now.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm working on that right now.
Okay, cool. And then we'll hopefully these test scores, the missing test will improve your grade by a lot.
Yeah, hopefully.
Okay. Just watch for my email sometime. If it's chapter 7, you'll probably get the email today. But if it's chapter 8, you'll get it later this week.
Okay.
Okay. Have a good rest of your
All right, thanks, mister.